Political chaos has gripped Venezuela, with the opposition leader declaring himself interim president and President Maduro severing relations with the U.S. What's the root of the problem, and how will this dramatic turn of events unfold? And China slammed a recent CNN report about a Uyghur refugee, calling the story a lie fabricated with ulterior motives. Why have stories from Xinjiang become so distorted, and what's the real story? Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you from Beijing. I'm Lu Xin. Long-simmering tensions between Venezuela and the U.S. exploded on Wednesday after the Trump administration announced it would back an opposition leader who declared himself the country's interim president early in the day. President Nicolas Maduro has accused the U.S. of plotting a coup and severed so-called diplomatic and political relations with the U.S., giving U.S. diplomats 72 hours to leave the country. Venezuela has been suffering an economic crisis of epic proportions under Maduro's leadership, with soaring inflation and chronic shortages of food and medicine. Many Venezuelans have fled the country in search of stability and opportunities. What does U.S. intervention mean for Venezuela? Given China has enjoyed good relations with the Venezuelan government, how does China look at the situation and the way out of the crisis? Joining me for the discussion in the Beijing studio is Victor Gao, Vice President at the Center for China and Globalization, and from Washington, D.C., Dr. Ivan Eland, Senior Fellow at the Independent Institute. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. First, let's take a look at what President Trump tweeted the other day when he recognized the opposition leader as the interim leader of Venezuela. He said, "The citizens of Venezuela have suffered far too long at the hands of the illegitimate Maduro regime. Today, I have officially recognized the president of the Venezuelan National Assembly, Juan Guaido, as the interim president of Venezuela." So let me go to Dr. Eland first. What are the considerations behind U.S. President Donald Trump's claim of the interim leader of Venezuela, especially from the geopolitical perspective?
Well, I think many in the international community regard the last election in Venezuela as rigged, and therefore the United States is supporting the leader of the National Assembly, which is a legitimate governing body in Venezuela until Maduro created his own legislative body in a sort of coup. So I don't think the United States really recognizes the government of Maduro, since it seems to be illegitimate in the eyes of many, including many of Venezuela's neighbors and the international community. And this declaration that they're agreeing that the assembly leader is the new interim president has really a lot of consequences, because there's a lot of Venezuelan assets that have been frozen in the United States, and that may give them over to the new government there, or the new interim government, and therefore they could use them for new elections, humanitarian aid, etc. So this is not just a symbolic declaration by the United States.
Well, you made many points, but let me point out that actually some 160 countries have diplomatic relations with the current incumbent Venezuelan government. So let's not think that the great majority of countries in the world believe that the government of Maduro is illegitimate. Quite the opposite. Dr. Gao, what is your take on this question? And also, what are other considerations that are possibly on the mind of the United States, given that Venezuela is a country so rich in natural resources? Is there any consideration there?
Well, for many years, relations between the United States and Venezuela is very antagonistic. The United States has viewed Venezuela and its governments as eyesore, and some decision makers in the United States still cling to the legacy of the Monroe Doctrine. And there is a temptation for the U.S. decision makers to intervene in the Venezuela situation. However, I would say among many Latin American countries, they more or less consider the Monroe Doctrine already dead, and they do not want to be a puppet of the United States. They want to strike out on their own. They want to put the premium on independence and their sovereignty and territorial integrity. Therefore, I sincerely hope the United States will not go to the length of military intervention in the situation in Venezuela. On the other hand, as you correctly pointed out, there is crisis in Venezuela, and the Chinese government has expressed the correct view, that is, all countries should refrain from interfering in the domestic affairs of Venezuela. Now, let me be the devil's advocate. The President of the United States, Mr. Trump, has been investigated by Special Prosecutor Mueller for the Russian connection, and there are suspicions that Russia interfered in the presidential election in 2016. Does this give any country to declare President Trump as the illegitimate president of the United States and to promote, for example, Hillary Clinton or the Democrat as the legitimate owner of the White House? No. The American people will rise up in arms against such temptations, for example. Therefore, I hope the Americans would also really put themselves in the same seat and try to refrain from picking sizes in Venezuela. Venezuela is now on the brink of possibly civil war, and let us give the Venezuelan people their right to do the right thing, and let's really hope the situation will calm down and stabilize rather than pouring fuel on the fire in Venezuela.
Well, Dr. Eland, you want to respond to that?
Well, I think, first of all, you say all these countries have diplomatic relations with Venezuela. So does the United States. Maduro is trying to kick the U.S. diplomats out, but the new assembly leader says he wants them to stay. So I think the U.S. is going to have diplomatic relations with Venezuela, whether they like it or not. The second thing is Maduro.
There are no diplomatic relations between the United States and Venezuela. The two countries do not have diplomatic. That's why I said so-called diplomatic relations, because they don't have diplomatic relations on an official level. They only have chargé d'affaires with each other, and now that is also being severed. So,
well, they're trying to kick they're trying to kick that out. So there are diplomats there. And so at some level they do, but this is beside the point, because many of Venezuela's neighbors, in fact virtually all of them, are against this government, because the government is, its socialist policies are driving hyperinflation. People can't get food, water, electricity, medicine, etc., and all the 3 million Venezuelans have left to go to other countries. This puts a burden on the other countries surrounding them. So I don't think you're going to find anybody in Latin America that's really supporting Maduro at this point. I agree. I don't think the United States should do anything militarily or anything like that, or try to launch a coup, because I think you know, first of all, that's failed in the past, and second of all, it just gives Maduro more support. I think Maduro is going to fall, and I think his time is up, and I think the United States should do what it did and nothing more.
Well, let the Venezuelan people figure out what they want to do, and let's not predict too soon the fate of Maduro. By the way, there are countries that are also standing with Maduro after the outbreak of this crisis. For instance, Mexico, Bolivia, Cuba, El Salvador, and Nicaragua. So not all countries in Latin America are against Maduro. Dr. Eland, you mentioned the socialist policy that is the reason why the country is suffering so much economically. You also talked about sanctions. Dr. Gao, is the socialist system to blame for the economic demise of this country? What are the roles of the U.S. sanctions on this country?
No, I don't think so. I think different countries in Latin America have their own rights to do their political and social experiments, to engage in reforms of all kinds, and regrettably to say, while many of the reforms may end up in success, there are reforms which may end up in disaster. So it's actually inevitable that some of the reforms may actually end up in fiascos. However, this doesn't give any country outside of these countries, for example, outside of Venezuela, any right to pick sides in Venezuela and try to impose their own political preference onto Venezuela. You may not like what's happening in Venezuela, but you really need to give the Venezuelan people their chance to make their own decision as to what political path they want to follow and what political system they want to choose. They have the right to pick socialism or capitalism, but it's their choice. It's not Canada's choice. It's not America's choice.
What about the sanctions, the effect of the sanctions on the Venezuelan economy? Dr. Gao.
Of course, the American imposed the sanctions against Venezuela on the government level, for example, really has made the situation much worse. Now, on the personal level, against the Venezuela leaders, political leaders, for example, have really taken a very, very big toll on the morale of the leadership in Venezuela and complicates the whole situation. I think the tendency and the instinct of the United States to impose sanctions on other countries in order to pursue its own geopolitical means and political objectives should be ended very soon. The sooner, the better.
Dr. Ivan, what do you say to the kind of possibility that let the people decide? China proposed that all sides should sit down for political dialogue. What is wrong with that? Why can't US President Donald Trump propose that kind of solution instead of declaring and polarizing the situation?
Well, I don't even think you ought to do that. I think you ought to just let events play out. I agree. I don't think the United States should intervene but with more sanctions or militarily or with CIA or anything else to try to affect the situation. I think that the situation is going to take care of itself because they've made such a mess of the Venezuelan economy. And certainly foreign sanctions usually have some sort of an effect on economies, but oftentimes leaders such as Castro in Cuba blame U.S. sanctions when most of the problem is their own economic policies. And I think that's the case here. So I wouldn't put any more sanctions on. I think Maduro's government is collapsing by the sheer weight of the economic crisis which his policies have led to.
Finally, Dr. Gao, what is China's proposal for such an issue? Of course, China doesn't want to see Latin America fall into upheaval. What would China suggest besides political dialogue and peaceful political dialogue between both sides?
Well, indeed, between China and Venezuela, China has major economic stake in Venezuela. China has probably the largest investment in Venezuela among all the Latin American countries, and China's cooperation with Venezuela, especially on the energy sector, on the infrastructure, has been very extensive and very wide-ranging. However, this doesn't give China any right or any excuse to interfere in the political situation in Venezuela. China may have its own preferences or its own ways to think about how development in Venezuela should be done for the betterment of the interests of the Venezuelan people, but China does not want to lecture our brothers and sisters in Venezuela. China has no eagerness at all to impose our preferences on the Venezuelan people.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Many thanks to Victor Gao, Vice President at the Center for China and Globalization, and from Washington, D.C., Dr. Ivan Eland, Senior Fellow at the Independent Institute. You're watching The Point with me, Liu Xi.